Hey, happy Friday, we made it. So I know last week we talked about Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies, and I had indicated that I didn't want to get us too trapped in the realm of the Fae because it would be very easy to do with all of the exciting fairy releases so far this year. But we're going to stay in that realm just one more week and talk about We Are Also Good at Smiling by Amber McBride, which does deal with Fae and fairy tales, but in a much, much different way than Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies does, and I would argue a lot of the fairy releases so far this year does. I think that they are all very different projects and different books and coming at the topic from a variety of angles. And this angle involves an exploration of grief and sorrow and depression. And so it is wading into some pretty deep waters, and it does warn us of that right out of the gate with an author's note. But here we are using fairy tales as a kind of overlay to talk about the really difficult things, which arguably is kind of what they're intended for anyway. So this starts with Whimsy, who is in the hospital dealing with her depression. We know this is not her first time in the hospital for this, and while she is there, she meets a boy fairy. And we know from the world that is created that Whimsy is a conjurer, and when we first meet Fairy through Whimsy's eyes, we get the outline of his wings and the knowledge that he is a fairy. And so there's a real bleeding of magic into this world, very much in line with magical realism, though I am always hesitant to use that as a descriptor outside of the Latin American canon. And so in Fairy, Whimsy recognizes a similar person, even if they don't necessarily hit it off right away in the hospital. Whimsy is still kind of keeping him at arm's reach. And she continues to do this even after he moves into her neighborhood. And we are, as readers, learning more about Whimsy the whole time here too. For instance, we learn that there is something hard and traumatic in her past, something that happened particularly in the forest that is keeping her from that place, making her kind of operate on the outskirts, on the very edge of the forest, something that forced her mother to take not only her memories, but the entire family's memories. And so Whimsy is kind of left with the remnants of these memories, but not the full picture, and the knowledge that no one else in her family can remember this either. And then we get a glimpse or just a fragmented reference to her brother, who we haven't met in the narrative. So we get a sense that there is something kind of looming in the shadows here, something bigger, some deeper kind of well of grief. So Fairy moves into the neighborhood, and we see him through Whimsy's eyes. We see how he interacts with his family through Whimsy's eyes, just these little fragments. And they end up going to school together. Whimsy is letting him in a little bit more, and then Fairy goes missing, and it is presumed that he has gone into the woods. And so Whimsy ends up going after him, and they both have to face their fears and sorrow to move through this place. It is very much the transformative liminal space of a forest, and while they are there, they must face a personified sorrow and move through these kind of tests almost that bring them in contact with these different fairy tale characters and stories, but also force them to face a lot of their fears. And as they are actively fighting through this grief and this sorrow and this fear, they are also getting closer to answers, and these new angles and forms of story do end up helping free them in some ways. And so it really does look at the importance of story, whether it's to help us find an escape at the beginning or help us find a way through toward the end. And all of it kind of explores too the different ways that stories can be perceived and interpreted, and how things can look different in different lights and mean different things at different times. For instance, there's this line, "The forest is haunted, like most forests are, but when I was young, I didn't mind." And another thing about this book is that it is told exclusively through poetry or verse. Now, if you've been with me for a second, I don't proclaim to be any kind of scholar when it comes to poetry, so I'm not going to be really analyzing the poetry of this so much, but I do think that there is something really special about it being told through verse. Now, I also promise that every time I talk about a young adult novel, I'm not going to be like, back in my day, but bear with me one second here. I grew up in the 2000s, and novels, especially in young adult, that were dealing with difficult subjects in verse were very popular. Think like your Crank as one of the more popular or most popular novels at the time, like the Ellen Hopkins books. But I think that this really, really works here because this novel is largely a very deep exploration of depression. And while I would never claim to deal with or have dealt with depression to this extent, I think that there's something that rings very true in the language here and the way it kind of mirrors the way a brain can work amidst all of this. There is that fragmentation, the kind of conservation of narrative energy, the stripping down to the barest possible form of the thing, while then also adding this extra poetic layer of metaphor and and symbolism and story to help kind of explore the thing without having to face the thing directly. And so much of this is about that exploration and that journey through grief and sorrow. So we've got this mirroring of this kind of magical landscape, the fairy tale stories, but then we are also kind of looking at this through a version of Dante's Inferno as well. They're reading Dante's Inferno in school. And then once we're in the forest, we're in this kind of limbo where we are moving through these characters' personal hell. And there are these kind of levels and circles of it. So I think that there are definite layers of exploration here. Now, the fairy tales themselves I loved, but at the same time found myself a little removed at times from what fairy tale was being used at what part of the forest, especially because we moved so conceptual once we entered that forest. We really were without kind of real bearings. And so we had to get a kind of home base established at first, which we did with this like house that sorrow is living in. And then we're moving out in these abstract ways, which I absolutely loved. However, some of these fairy tales didn't feel as connected to what that level was about. And that could have just been me, because these fairy tales were seeded earlier in the novel to come back to. Oddly enough, stay with me here, I think that if you liked the kind of liminal space, kind of wasteland at the heart of House of Hollow by Crystal Sutherland, I think you will also like the kind of liminal space we're exploring here, because it is very abstract and it is about what these characters are kind of moving through mentally to get out and through this, because it is really emphasizing the moving through. This idea that to get out, you must move through, whether that is physical space or the kind of mental hurdles. Now, I could also see an argument or an interpretation of this that would read that this is implying that depression is something you can overcome because of the kind of narrative build of this, that we are kind of getting out of the forest. That is the goal, or the goal is to overcome this thing. And I don't believe, especially based on the author's notes, that it is intending to imply that depression can be overcome. Rather, I think it is kind of one of the pitfalls of the narrative structure, and I think it tries to get around that to some extent. I think it's trying to build a somewhat circular structure, especially in the forest. It feels like we're going around and around, kind of like circling the drain in some ways, but at the end of the day, we still have set up this expectation that we have to get through this. And it very much emphasizes that idea of moving through. And I understand that as well, because these characters have been really avoiding their emotions. They have been packing all of this down and not dealing with it. So there is a lot of strength in just kind of facing these emotions head on. And I very much think that that is what the narrative is trying to explore, especially because it very intentionally and specifically labels the kind of character in the forest that they're facing off against sorrow. And I definitely understand that that could be interpreted multiple ways, but I definitely, within the context of the narrative, think it is about facing this event that is looming in our characters' pasts so that we can move forward past it in whatever way that looks like. And there is incredible healing there, but it doesn't feel like it is about fixing the characters or implying that they are fixed at the end, which I also think is a very interesting angle too, especially within fairy tales. I've mentioned this before, who knows when, but when I was in college, I took a fairy tale class. And one of the things that we kept coming back to in our discussions in that class, because it was like a more colloquia, discussion-based thing, is that so many fairy tales really take this idea of healing and becoming whole again, and the kind of problems with some of those metaphors and the implication that people are not complete or whole before. And so there is still a lot of weight to this. And it doesn't really grapple completely with what all of these stories mean to Whimsy, or what kind of escape she is necessarily finding in them. And I think that it would have been really interesting to kind of balance the escape that they've been for her a little bit more, kind of seeing that morph within the forest and the garden a little bit more. I did like the wide variety of fairy tales and stories that exist within Whimsy's world. And while I did have the critique that they didn't necessarily feel specific enough, I think it was more that the fullness of the specificity wasn't communicated. I could tell that they had been chosen very specifically for these different phases. And I just wanted to understand that a little bit more and be pulled into that a little bit more, I think. Some of the metaphor went over my head a little bit, unfortunately, which is neither here nor there. It could have just been how much I was really paying attention or understanding in the moment too. So user error is of course always on the table, but especially when you have language this pared down, this specific, this succinct, it then becomes very delicate maneuvering in moving through the narrative and kind of making sure all of the pieces land how they're supposed to, and that we can feel that kind of emotional impact, feel the forward momentum of the narrative while not rushing through anything, and also feel like everything has been kind of set up properly, which I do. I think that we see the callbacks later in the novel, see where things had been kind of placed earlier in the story to get us where we needed to go, and there was still that beautiful language and metaphor, especially towards the end. There's some pieces that really resonated with me, and this I'm going to edit slightly in my reading to you because I don't want to spoil anything, but this really stuck with me. It says, "Will you disappear? Yes," blank says, "but we will haunt you whenever you like." And that really hit me. This novel is dealing with grief and sorrow in a much, much different way than I have been dealing with kind of your normal as it can ever be, grief and sorrow from losing my grandpa and my aunt within the past year. But I will admit that that is something that I have thought about. This idea of missing someone so much and almost wishing that they would haunt you, wishing for that connection, that comfort, that knowledge that the person you care about is still there, still with you, still looking over you in some capacity. And these characters feel incredibly alone for a lot of this narrative, especially in this idea that they are alone in their grief, that their memories have been altered in some ways, so their reality is different and they are alone in this separate reality in some ways. They feel isolated from so much, and you've got all of this exacerbated by the teen years and depression, and yet this narrative looks at all of this bleakness, this darkness, this sadness, this grief, and manages to also find these little moments of wonder and magic, and using that to explore all of the darker things. It doesn't take away from the darkness, and it doesn't belittle what grappling with that darkness means. Rather, it in many ways recognizes the real strength that comes from that. And I really appreciate the metaphor here because I think that kind of imbuing this facing of these harder emotions, kind of staring straight into the sorrow, giving it a more active shape, and making the facing of that a more physical kind of manifestation, I think that that illustrates how hard a lot of this can often be. And this novel really does live in the realm of metaphor. Even at the end in the author's note, the author is like, "This garden is a metaphor." And whimsy and fairy are metaphors to a certain extent, and I kind of like the bleeding of not knowing what is real, what may be projection, what is actual magic bleeding into this world. And I think the truth of that is going to be different for every reader, and I think that there's something really special in that as well because it can be what any reader needs it to be. However, I read it as the narrative was imbuing this with this little bit of magic, with this bleed over. It believed in this magic while also recognizing when things like the fairy tale world moving in and encroaching were a kind of upset of the balance. So I thought it was a really interesting world that it created in a very little amount of space. It's only like 275 pages in verse. So it's not long by any means, but it definitely has a forward momentum to it. And it feels like we are in those woods for a little bit of time, and not in a way where we as readers feel like we are also trapped and can't get out and are stuck in like this narrative purgatory, but in a way that gives the journey real weight, and it makes us really invested in the stakes with these characters. And like I said, there is a sense of movement to everything. It definitely feels like we are pushing forward within that space and making progress, even while it sometimes feels circular and makes us feel like we're trapped, which I know sounds contradictory, but I promise you is not, and is actually really special in how it is maneuvering both, because I think both are very necessary for the kind of internal journey that we are on and how that internal journey is being projected externally so that we can kind of conceptualize it easier. Now, all that being said, the comp titles that the blurb gives are They Both Die at the End meets The Bell Jar, which I both understand and am like, why? What? I both get it because you're often comping to the biggest kind of common denominator titles, but also I absolutely do not get it at the same time. So if you've read this and you have better comp titles for this book, please leave them below because I feel like there have to be better comp titles. At the same time, would those comp titles get you to read this book? For me, the hook was both the cover and then like the fairy tale and fae angle of everything, but that's not necessarily everyone's hook. So if you've already read this, what made you pick it up? And if you haven't read this yet, what is the thing, if you are interested in picking it up, that is the most exciting to you? Like what is sparking your interest the most? But all that being said, I think it was a magical, metaphorical, and compassionate look at grief and sorrow and depression and mental health. And I also think that it was ultimately an excellent use of the liminal space. And I do love a good liminal space. So if you've read this, I would love to hear your thoughts, especially if you can illuminate on the poetry angle better than I can, though interested in your thoughts regardless. Thanks for hanging out and listening to mine as always. Like and subscribe if you feel like it, read something good, and yeah, bye.